Subscribe to Sinister Shadow Studio, The Forgotten Melody. Every town has its legends, whispered tales passed down through generations. In my quaint coastal town of Merlowe, it was the Waverley Mansion. More specifically, its grand piano that bore a curse. Built in the early 1900s, the Waverley Mansion was home to Eleanor, a piano prodigy. Rumor had it that her love for music was unmatched, and her melodies could make even the most stone-hearted weep. One fateful night, she disappeared, leaving only a hauntingly beautiful composition on her piano. Since then, no one had been able to play that piece entirely. Those who tried were said to vanish, just like Eleanor. Being an amateur pianist, my curiosity often got the best of me. One chilly autumn evening, I decided to challenge the myth. Armed with a lantern and my unwavering skepticism, I entered the mansion. The air inside was thick with the weight of forgotten memories. Dust-covered portraits lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow my every move. In the grand ballroom stood the infamous piano, its ebony and ivory keys glimmering in the lantern light. With bated breath, I began playing Eleanor's composition. The melody was eerie, full of pain and longing. The room seemed to come alive. Shadows danced, and the wind howled. As I approached the final notes, I felt an icy grip on my hand, preventing me from completing the piece. The room grew colder, and in the dim light, I saw her, Eleanor. Her eyes were hollow, her face etched with anguish. "Why have you come?" she whispered, her voice echoing in the vast room. "To challenge the legend," I replied, trying to mask my fear. A sad smile formed on her lips. "It's not a legend. It's a prison. The melody you played is my unfinished symphony, the song of my heart. I was taken before I could complete it, trapped in this eternal limbo." "Who took you?" I asked, entranced by her tragic beauty. "A suitor I scorned, envious of the love I reserved for my music. In his rage, he bound my spirit to this room, to this piano, allowing me freedom only when my symphony is completed. But anyone who attempts to finish it joins me in this torment." Tears welled up in my eyes. "I'll help you, Eleanor." She shook her head. "You'll be trapped like the rest?" But I was resolute. "Play with me," I urged. "Together we'll complete your symphony." As our fingers danced across the keys, the room transformed. The decaying walls were restored to their former glory, the dusty portraits gleamed with life, and the shadows turned into guests, waltzing gracefully. The final notes lingered in the air, and a blending light enveloped us. When it dimmed, I found myself alone in the ballroom. The piano silent and Eleanor nowhere in sight. However, etched into the piano's wood was a new inscription: "Eleanor's Symphony, completed with love." I left the mansion, the first to challenge the legend and return. The tale of the cursed piano shifted, becoming a story of love, sacrifice, and redemption. The Waverley Mansion, once feared, became a place of pilgrimage. Musicians from around the world visited, not to challenge a curse but to play Eleanor's symphony, and bask in its haunting beauty. And as for me, every year on that fateful autumn evening, I'd return to the mansion, sit by the piano, and play our symphony. And sometimes, just sometimes, in the echoes of the final notes, I'd hear Eleanor's soft whisper, thanking me for setting her spirit free. Whispers from room 313. After years of city living, I jumped at the chance to manage the old Somerset Hotel in Linton, a town where everyone knew everyone and the pace was leisurely. The hotel, a grand structure from the 1800s, had seen better days, but its history was part of its charm. The townspeople often shared stories of the hotel's colorful past, but one story in particular stood out. Room 313 was said to be haunted by the ghost of a young woman named Clara, who died under mysterious circumstances. As a self-proclaimed skeptic, I dismissed the rumors. That was until peculiar things began happening. Lights in room 313 would flicker, even when the room was vacant. Guests reported hearing faint whispers, always mentioning a name: Henry. My staff became reluctant to go near that room, especially after dark. Curiosity piqued, I decided to spend a night in room 313. If there was any truth to the legends, I wanted to experience it firsthand. The room was surprisingly ordinary, with elegant wallpapers and antique furnishings. As night fell, the ambiance began to change. A cold breeze circled the room despite the windows being shut. The grandfather clock, which I was told hadn't worked in years, began ticking, each second echoing ominously. Just past midnight, whispers filled the room. The voice was soft, sad, and distinctly feminine. "Henry, why?" Over and over. Drawn to the sound, I found myself standing in front of a tarnished mirror. The reflection showed not just me, but a figure of a woman, Clara. Our eyes met. Hers were filled with pain and betrayal. "Do you know Henry?" she asked. "No," I replied shakily. "Who is he?" Tears streamed down her face. "My love. Or so I thought. He brought me to this room, promised me forever, but he betrayed me." A scene began to play in the mirror. A younger Clara, laughing with a man, Henry. They danced, they kissed. But as the night wore on, their voices grew heated. Accusations were thrown, and in a fit of rage, Henry pushed Clara. She hid her head, her lifeless eyes staring accusingly at him. Panicking, he fled the room, leaving Clara behind. The vision faded, and I found myself back in the present, with Clara's spirit still gazing at me. "I can't move on," she sobbed. "Not until he knows the pain he caused." Empathy replaced my fear. "What can I do?" She looked at me, hope gleaming in her eyes for the first time. "Help me confront him. Help me find peace." I nodded. But how would I find someone from a century ago? The following day, I began digging into Linton's archives. To my surprise, I found out that Henry was not just any guest. He was part of Linton's founding family and had lived his days in a mansion not far from the hotel. While he had died years ago, his last living relative, an old man named Charles, still resided in Linton. With a deep breath, I knocked on the doors of the grand mansion. Charles, frail but sharp-eyed, listened intently as I told him about Clara and my supernatural encounter. He sighed deeply. "It's a family shame we've carried for generations. My grandfather, Henry, confessed on his deathbed about a woman he loved and wronged. He lived with the guilt but never had the courage to face it." I told him about Clara's restless spirit and her desire for acknowledgement of the wrong done to her. Charles nodded. "Then let's give her that closure." That night, we sat in room 313, waiting. As the clock struck midnight, Clara appeared, her gaze fixed on Charles. "Henry?" she whispered. Charles stepped forward. "Not Henry, but his grandson, Charles. I'm here to apologize for what he did, to acknowledge the pain and betrayal." Clara's eyes welled up. "That's all I ever wanted." The room grew warmer, the tension easing. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her figure becoming fainter. Charles and I left the room, the weight of the past finally lifted. Room 313 was silent after that night, but guests often reported a comforting warmth, a sign that Clara was at peace. As for me, I became a storyteller, recounting the tale of love, betrayal, and redemption that played out in the Somerset Hotel. And room 313? It became the most requested room, not for the scares, but for the story it held within its walls. The Echoes of Emery House. I've always been a logical person. So when I inherited the old Emery House from an aunt I'd never met, the last thing on my mind was ghost stories. The estate had sat abandoned for decades, but I saw potential in its crumbling walls and decided to renovate it into a bed and breakfast. The history of Emery House was clouded with dark tales. The most popular was about Eleanor Emery, a young woman who had mysteriously vanished in the house over a century ago. While some say she eloped, others whispered about her being trapped in the house's endless rooms and hallways, her spirit yearning for release. The first few weeks of renovation went smoothly. The old house seemed to breathe again, its musty air replaced by the scent of fresh paint and polished wood. That's when the oddities began. It started with echoes. Whenever I'd call out to the workers or hum a tune, my voice would echo back minutes later, even if I was alone. Initially, I dismissed it as the house's strange acoustics, but things grew stranger. One evening, while reviewing the renovation plans, I heard a soft sobbing. Following the sound, I arrived at a room I'd never seen before, even though I was certain I'd explored every nook and cranny. The door bore an intricate E, presumably for Emery. Inside, the room was untouched by time. At the center stood a beautiful vanity, and on it lay an open diary. The last entry was by Eleanor Emery. "They won't let me leave. The house changes, rooms shift, and I'm trapped in this loop. If anyone reads this, please, find a way to free me." The sobbing grew louder, and the room grew colder. Then a soft voice echoed, "Help me." I rushed out, my heart pounding. Determined to unravel the mystery, I decided to spend the night in Alara's room. As night enveloped Emery House, a chilling draft swept through. The echoes returned. This time they weren't just mine, but whispers of countless voices, recounting tales of sorrow and despair. Midnight approached, and the room transformed. Mirrors reflected distorted rooms, the furniture aged and decayed, and Alara, a translucent figure, appeared before me. Her eyes, pools of eternal sadness, met mine. "You found my room," she whispered. "But you must hurry. The house is awake." The walls began to close in, and the echoes grew deafening. Guided by Alara, we navigated shifting hallways and staircases that led nowhere. The house moaned and groaned, resisting our every move. Hours seemed to pass before we finally arrived at the grand foyer. A massive chandelier, its crystals resonating with the echoes, hung above. Clara pointed to it. "The heart of the house. Break it, and you break the curse." But how? The chandelier was high, and beneath it was a deep, endless void. Taking a deep breath, I hurled a heavy statuette at it. The impact sent shockwaves, and as the chandelier shattered, the house let out a deafening scream. Daylight broke, revealing a calm and silent Emery House. Clara, now radiant, stood by the doorway. "Thank you," she smiled, fading into the morning mist. The bed and breakfast idea was abandoned. Instead, I turned Emery House into a memorial, a testament to its history and the spirit of Clara. The echoes had ceased, but sometimes in the stillness of the night, I'd hear a soft, grateful whisper, reminding me of the soul I'd set free. Subscribe to Sinister Shadow Studio.